Falcha, welcome back. This is Irish Granny, and this is part 5 of our book this weekend, The Dawn of Everything. And since it's such a lengthy book and there's going to be a number of videos continuing, I thought I'd just try to do one, possibly two today, and we'll see how that goes. So part 5, I promised, was going to start with a story of the Chetco Nation of Oregon. The Chetkos say that many seasons ago, their ancestors came in canoes from the far north and landed at the river's mouth. They found 2 tribes in possession, one a warlike race resembling themselves. These they soon conquered and exterminated. The other was a diminutive people of an exceedingly mild disposition and white. These called themselves, or were called by the newcomers, Wogies. They were skillful in the manufacture of baskets, robes, and canoes, and had many methods of taking fish and game which were unknown to the invaders. Refusing to fight, the Wogies were made slaves of and kept at work to provide food and shelter and articles for the use of the more warlike race, who waxed very fat and lazy. One night, however, after a grand feast, the Wogies packed up and fled and were never more seen. When the first white men appeared and the Chetkos supposed that they were the Wogies returned. They soon found out their mistake, however, but retained among themselves the appellation for the white men, who are known as Wogies by all the coastal tribes in the vicinity. So, that's from the Oregon coast. It's something of a moral tale about slavery in the area that is a boundary between Northwest slaves and the California area that had no slaves. And it shows sort of a bit of an ambivalence about the whole idea of slavery. It indicates that slavery was a moral choice and a political choice, and that different cultures were judgmental about it. So here's the story of a hero who is defeated, and he makes his fame and enslaves travelers, and the hero, and then there's another guy. The hero confronts the other guy who makes his way by assaulting travelers and enslaving them. No, I don't want to be like you, summoning boats to the shore, seizing them and their cargo, and making people slaves. As long as you live, you will never be tyrannous again, but like other men. If you return to your former ways, I will kill you. Perhaps I should take you for a slave now, but I will not. Stay in your home and keep what is yours, and leave people alone. To the slaves who stood about nearly filling the riverbank, our hero said to them, go to your homes. You are free now. The people who had been enslaved surrounded him, weeping and thanking him and wanting to drag his boat back into the water. No, I'll drag it myself, he said, and then with one hand he lifted it to the river. So the freed people all scattered, some downriver and some upriver, to their homes. So Northwest Native raiding and slave collecting wasn't necessarily appreciated by other cultures close to that area. So now we have this theory called the optimal foraging theory. And it was figured out by studying bees and fish and starlings. And it frames behavior in terms of economic rationality. The things that people do are rationally chosen based on the effort for the return. Foragers will do the minimum outlay for the maximum return. It's a cost-benefit calculation, and apparently throughout history, cultures have sort of shown this to be true. California foragers looked for the food that they needed, and they did a lot of work, but how come they didn't fish? because they were in California. They were right there by the coast. They could have fished. California food was so easy to get and easy to store, and it was hard to process to eat. So the Northwest fish were easy to process, but it had to be done right away or they would rot. And the theory evolved that they became warlike because they started to maraud other tribes for storable food. And the Californians were not warlike because they didn't need to do that. Also, the nobility did not think they should have to work. This was a big conundrum and was talked about quite a bit in the Northwest tribes. They did not believe in coercing their members into doing things they didn't want to do. And the people just basically refused to do the really, really hard work. And so they started kidnapping people to do it. And as long as those people did the work and assimilated into the tribe, they were essentially no longer treated as slaves. They just got more slaves. And it was slavery was a conscious decision to control a labor pool. And there's a slight bit of a difference in the Pacific coast called the Shatter Zone. And there was a pioneer ethnographer by the name of Alfred Graeber. How come they always have to have hard to pronounce names? Nobody's name is Smith. Anyway, Alfred Graeber, I think, who came up with this theory of the Shatter Zone, which was an area of unusual diversity that bridged two great cultural areas. So you had the extremes on either end, and in the middle you had this melding together of different ideas, some of them rejected and some of them adopted. There were a number of ethnic language groups that were compressed into this small area, and some spoke the northern version and some spoke the southern version, and some had assumed northern behaviors and cultural habits, and some had assumed the southern behaviors, but none had slaves. So in the north, slaves made up 25% of the population, which really rivals the numbers of full-blown slaves in cultures like Athens and the American South. The economy and the wealth of the nobles were preserved by this slave labor. And when and how did their tribes in the Shatter Zone stop keeping slavery, or maybe not ever adopt slavery? And when needs to be researched still. They have not been able to discover actually when that happened. Why is a whole other thing, or how is a whole other thing. In many of these groups, there were customs designed to stop slavery from being permanent. So they think it may have been a gradual moving away from it, starting with slavery was not a permanent institution. Slavery was temporary till the work was done, and then you got to be adopted. The Yurok, I didn't make that up, it's Y-U-R-O-K. I assume that's how it's pronounced. Made victors of battles pay compensation for each life that was taken in battle, like murder. You had to pay compensation. And this made raiding for slaves not a very financially or morally smart decision. So that contributed to the diminishment of slavery. The Chetko tale that I read to you shows that neighbors looked down on these warlike slave-taking cultures, and they didn't like the exploiting of people, and they wanted leisure. They just didn't like that. They frowned on them, and they didn't want to be like what they considered the fat and lazy nobles of the North. And it seems like the Southern cultures positioned themselves as the opposite of these North. They looked at themselves morally. It's that opposition again. In the North, no highborn male would stoop, literally or figuratively, to carry water or to chop wood. It was beneath them. They just refused to do it. People in the South didn't understand this, but this was the attitude of the people in the North. All men, particularly the youth, were exhorted to gather wood for use in sweating, the sweat lodges. This was not exploitation of child labor, but an important religious act freighted with significance. Special wood was brought from the mountain ridges. We're talking about the Californians now. It was used for an important purification ritual. The gathering itself was a religious act, for it was a means of acquiring luck. It had to be done with the proper psychological attitude, of which restrained demeanor and constant thinking about the acquisition of riches were the chief elements. The job became a moral end rather than a means to an end, with both religious and economic involvement. So interesting. Let's see here. So in order to participate in these ritual sweat lodges, you had to conform to the standards of the South, because if you were really overweight, you couldn't even get into the sweat lodge, and it was an uncomfortable experience, and it was just frowned on to not be in a condition where this was an important religious ritual, a bonding for the community, and something that you were judged about. It's like, if you don't go to the gym. What do you mean you don't go to the gym? Northern spirituality was often about trickery, optical illusions. This is really interesting. They had rituals, both religious and mythological, and they involved fooling people, wearing masks, pretending to be what you weren't. And the word in their language for ritual was illusion. And in the South, spirituality was 100% an inward pursuit. They didn't indulge in masks. They didn't put on pantomimes or acting that in any way were created to fool people. And in the North, they did. Whites adopted by the North had lavish naming ceremonies. Whites adopted by the South were forced to chop wood and carry water and earn their place with real people who worked hard. The North valued creative expression and theatrics. The South valued early to bed, early to rise, work all day. They valued not sleeping. It was a sign of moral integrity to not need a lot of hours of sleep every night, which I think is really interesting and kind of sad. So as he accumulates himself and becomes cleaner, the person in training with these southern tribes sees himself as more and more real, and thus the world as more and more beautiful, a real place and experience than merely a setting for a story or intellectual knowledge. In 1865, Captain Spot, for instance, trained for many weeks as he helped the medicine man prepare for the first salmon ceremony at the mouth of the Klamath River. The old medicine man sent him to bring down sweathouse wood. On the way he cried with nearly every step, because now he was seeing with his own eyes how it was done. Tears, crying, are of crucial importance in Yurok spiritual training as manifestations of personal yearning, sincerity, humility, and openness. And this is the tribe that was sort of halfway between the two. So in some of these cultures, your possessions and your wealth were burned when you died. They had no hereditary stuff going on at all. Rich people got a benefit from war by lending money to the losers to pay off tribute. So they had like a little banking thing going on. So how much difference does human agency, free will, make in the development of a culture? There's really no way to know with these really old cultures, because there's no tangible evidence that's left. This book assumes that we probably have more say over our destiny than history ordinarily assumes. The North Coast natives couldn't force their people to do all the work, and so they took slaves, but then they valued the slaves. In Southern California, the natives respected the slaves, but they respected hard work on their own part. In between, there was a conscious effort to act the opposite of the neighbors. This sort of complexity it doesn't make domination inevitable. So the theories that hierarchical cultures inevitably led to domination and inequality, that's not inevitable, because look at the variety of systems of domination or lack thereof that existed in parallel at the same time. It seems that hierarchy and not equality existed at the same time as complements or reactions against each other. So now we have chapter 6, which is called the Gardens of Adonis. The ancient Greeks had a rite of women only growing small pots of quick sprouting seeds, and they took them up on the rooftops and they left them to die. And this had to be done by women. It was accompanied by grieving and drunkenness. So what was that all about? Well, this came from a much more ancient set of fertility rites from Mesopotamia to the shepherd god, the personification of plant life, whose Greek incarnation was Adonis. And these little pots of plants were called the Gardens of Adonis. So the debate is this a ritual that was lost to masculinity as hunting gave way to agriculture? Is this like a grieving for lost masculinity? Or is this a subversion of patriarchal values, the antithesis of the serious rites of thesmophoria, which were rites to Demeter, dedicated to serious farming by wives of Athenian citizens only? So what the point that they're making is, we've got these evidences of odd ritual rites going around planting, and sometimes they're greeted with grief, and sometimes they're greeted as an honor to the god to encourage planting. Sometimes they're allowed to die, everybody gets drunk and cries. Sometimes it's considered a good thing to encourage produce. And we can make all sorts of assumptions. Was this done because, oh, this is so sad, the hunting is gone and masculinity is lost because now we're farmers? Or is this just to please the gods? Or is this some sort of female ritual that we don't really understand that represents cyclical fertility? I mean, you could put all sorts of meaning into it, and it's difficult to know. This begs a bigger question. Was farming about the serious problem of producing enough food for a larger population, or did farming have an entirely different sort of purpose or importance? Did it rise from these gardens of Adonis? Were they first ritual and then became gardening? Or was it first gardening and then became ritual and farming? So the most famous Neolithic site is a place called Catalhoyuk, and it's the world's oldest town. It's in central Turkey. It was settled in 7,400 BC, and it lasted 1,500 years. I mean, that's a long time. From beginning to end, it was a town for the same amount of time that separates us from the Vandals of 523 AD. That's the length of time that this place was inhabited. And it had a population of 5,000 people. It had, when I first moved to this area, the town next to us had a population of 5,000 people. We're not a whole lot bigger, but, that's a small town. Big in those days, though, because you're talking about little villages of a couple of hundred people. So it sort of puts everything in perspective. Interesting facts about this town. It had no town center. It had no communal facilities like a big town hall or amphitheater or central agora. It had no streets. It just had house after house, each accessed by a ladder up to the roof. So they didn't even have doors. You got into the house by climbing a ladder and going across the roof. They had what is described as dreary uniformity. identical mud walls, and a weird sense of interior design. They had a central living room, and the rest of these houses spread out from this central room, kind of built around it. But that wasn't the only weird thing about it. If you ever glimpsed at the inside, If you ever glimpsed the inside of a Catalhoyuk house, you will never forget its central living rooms, no more than 16 feet across. Now this gets interesting. With the skulls and horns of cattle and other creatures projecting inwards from the walls and sometimes outwards from the fittings and furnishings. It's sort of like a Montana hunting lodge. Many rooms also had vivid wall paintings and fittings, figurative moldings, and they contained platforms under which resided some portion of the household dead. Remains of between 6 and 60 individuals in any given house propping up the living. So perhaps John Wayne Gacy is a direct descendant. We can't help recalling Maurice Sendak's vision of a magical house where the walls became the world all around. So, very interesting. The first large settlement that we know practiced agriculture was here. These were the first settled population that got most of its nutrition from domesticated animals and crops. And when they were first uncovered in the 1960s, it was called the Agricultural Revolution. And there's a whole new way of looking at it now. But since the 1990s, new methods of fieldwork at Catalhoyuk produced a string of surprises which oblige us to revise both the history of the world's oldest town and also how we think about the origins of farming in general. The cattle, it turns out, were not domesticated. Those impressive skulls belonged to fierce wild aurochs. The shrines were not shrines, but houses in which people engaged in such everyday tasks as cooking, eating, and crafts, just like anywhere else, except they happened to contain a large density of ritual paraphernalia. Even the mother goddess has been cast into shadow. It is not so much that corpulent female figurines stopped turning up entirely in the excavations, but that the new finds tended to appear not in shrines or on thrones, but in trash dumps outside the houses with the heads broken off, and they didn't really seem to have been treated as objects of religious veneration. So at first they thought, okay, this is the beginning of agriculture. It's the explosion of farming. Here we go. This proves it. Long time settlement, lots and lots of people. It's because they grew things on their rooftops before this, and it eventually became agriculture. And they found all these figurines, and they had assumed that it was some sort of goddess religion. And then they realized, well, wait a minute, they're not being treated with reverence. What's going on here? So what they learned is, don't assume. In Victorian era, it was assumed that matriarchies were the major types of organizations of Neolithic societies. And therefore, every female figurine they found was a goddess. And maybe, these guys are saying, maybe we made a mistake. And maybe they were just the equivalent of Barbies. And maybe we just don't know, and we should not assume. To suggest that women were prominent in these early farming communities met with academic censure, because of course it did. And these cultures were once romanticized as beneficent matriarchal cultures ruled by priestesses of the goddesses until they were overrun by violent patriarchal Indo-European horsemen and Semitic nomads. So this is what the Victorians sort of romantically believed. And it was a huge political divide in the early 1900s, the late 19th century, early 20th century. A woman named Matilda Joslyn Gage, from 1826 to 1898 was her life, was a prominent American feminist. Now, this is kind of probably be interesting to everybody here. It's sort of the evolution of the coming and going and the coming again of feminist thought. She was very anti-Christian. She was a defender of indigenous rights. Now, keep in mind, this would have been probably in the middle 1800s, towards the end of the 1800s. And she was a big defender of the concept of matriarchies. And she was actually adopted as a Mohawk clan mother. She spent her last years living with her son-in-law. Guess who he was? I saw this and I just about died. L. Frank Baum, the guy who wrote the Wizard of Oz books. And if you have never read the original series of the Wizard of Oz books, it would behoove you. The movie's great. The books are better. And there's a lot of them. And the artwork, if you can get the original artwork, fantastic. He also wrote a couple of books that had nothing to do with Oz. One of them is The Magical Monarch of Mo. And oh my God, one of my favorite books as a child. But I'm digressing here. So she lived with L. Frank Baum, the creator of The Wizard of Oz, and his books were influenced by her because if you read his books, they were full of strong women and strong leaders and, like General Ginger and Ozma, and not one single male authority figure of any true authority because the wizard wasn't powerful. So Matilda wrote a book called Woman, Church, and State in 1893, and it talks about mother rule, government, and religion modeled on the mother-child relationship. So of course, that was met with great hilarity by men. Then there's a guy called Otto Gross, who was the student of Freud. He was an anarchist. Now remember, anarchy's not about chaos. It's just, let's not have leaders. And he worked with Kafka, and he was a Dadaist, and he worked with Max Weber. He believed that the superego, that Freudian thing, was really the patriarchy, and it needed to be destroyed to release the benevolent matriarchal collective unconscious. And this is sort of what they associated with the Neolithic, a collective unconscious that was matriarchal and pacifist. And he encouraged doing this with drugs and polyamory. So these people are really pretty interesting. So after World War I, the Nazis took up the story claiming the patriarchal invaders. So they co-opted this feminist take on ancient history and said that these patriarchal invaders were their master race's ancestors, the predecessors of the Aryan race, and they're justified in their violence and their subjugation of women, blah, blah, blah. Today, academics reject the idea of a primitive matriarchy. I didn't realize this. I sort of just assumed we all knew it was true. I'm learning quite a bit from this book, but mainstream academics reject the notion of primitive matriarchies, and they write off anybody who is an exponent of it, like Matilda Gage and Gross and all these guys. And why is this so taboo? Why does the notion that maybe once women had an influence that was pacifying on culture, why is that so hard to believe? So this modern rejection seems to be a backlash against a woman named Maria Gimbutas, and I hope I'm saying that right. She was Lithuanian. And I'd like to interject right here just one of those weird, synchronistic, psychic, bizarre things that happen to me all the time. It is just weird. I got a comment from a viewer. It was very interesting. And it was about this woman in Lithuania and how she'd been sort of sidelined by the mainstream and rejected, and maybe I'd be interested in covering her sometime. This is last week. And I read the links and I looked her up on the internet, and it was really very interesting. Didn't necessarily have all of this context. So I start reading this book, and as I'm reading this story of this woman in Lithuania, the light bulb went on over my head. This is the woman that my viewer, our friend, was talking about. Blew my mind. So you know who you are. I'm sure this is going to be a thrill for you to hear this, because we're going to talk about her and give her the acknowledgement that she deserves, because yes, she was sidelined, and how they did it was reprehensible. Let me read to you about it, and I'm going to mispronounce everything. So her name is Gimbutas. I'm going to call her Gimbutas. Maria Gimbutas. She was a Lithuanian American archaeologist. American because she had moved to the United States to become a citizen. In the 1960s and 70s, she was the authority on the prehistory of Eastern Europe. In 1982, she wrote a book, The Goddesses and Gods of Old Europe. And she tried to craft this narrative of the origins of a Eurasian civilization, Eastern Europe, Central Asia, the area, Belarus, Ukraine, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, those areas. And that Eurasian civilization included the concept of culture areas that we've discussed before, just spotty places that differing cultures sprout and flourish parallel to each other, sometimes influencing each other, sometimes rejecting each other very consciously, but developing side by side, some in agriculture and some in herding or in foraging, and tossing out of the window a lot of the modern day prevalent beliefs. And she had evidence to back this up. So she has this notion, and she argued that the old Victorian story about the goddess worshipping farmers and the Aryan invaders, the horsemen who came from the east, the northeast, was a true story. And she had narratives to back it up. Today, in mainstream archaeology and mainstream history, that's considered oddball, new agey. She was accused of trying to revive old fantasies, and this is not true. But the pushbacks made it impossible to speculate about hierarchies and exploitation that came into the domestic sphere. It makes it impossible to study all of this because you're tainted by association if you bring up her work. So unless you argue with a Rousseauian farming attitude that gave power to husbands over their wives and to fathers over their kids, that Roman paterfamilias stuff, nobody wants to hear you. Nobody wants to talk about it. That's for the New Age bookstores. Nobody wants to be bothered. So she studied old Europe, especially Eastern Europe, between 7000 and 3500 BC. She claims that there were Neolithic villages from the Balkans to the Mediterranean Sea and north, that men and women were of equal value. That doesn't necessarily mean they did things the same, that they had equal value, made equal contributions. There wasn't men's important work and women's work. There was equal value. Wealth and status was sharply circumscribed. They did not put value on hierarchical property, possession, and status. They were peaceful. They shared a common pantheon under a supreme goddess. It was a religious cult with many female figurines, some wearing masks. They have been found in Neolithic settlements from the Balkans to the Middle East, evidence of this. They came to a catastrophic end in the 3rd millennium BC, around 3500 BC. They were overrun by a migration of cattle keepers, the Kurgan, from the Pontic steppes of the north of the Black Sea. Now, the Kurgan were these grassland horsemen who built earthen tumuli. They heaped over the graves of male warriors with weapons and ornaments of gold and extravagant animal and slave sacrifice. Warrior culture was very valued. So they were completely antithetical to the ethos and the culture and the communitarianism of the more matriarchal, pacifist old Europe. And these invaders were patriarchal, warlike, militaristic, aristocratic, hierarchical, dominant. Okay. So she believes that they were responsible for the Western spread of Indo-European language, new societies with a radical subordination of women, and the elevation of warriors to a ruling elite. The Victorians believed this. They believed that matriarchy was the original human condition. Because of the physiology of paternity was not understood, the earliest people, they think, believed that they didn't understand insemination. They didn't understand how you got pregnant. They thought the woman did it all. So women were the most important. And this is really long time ago. So this would imply, if this is true, and a lot of this stuff, as we'll soon find out, has been proven to be true, this would assume that hunter-gatherers were also matriarchal. So Gimbutas was merely arguing women's autonomy in ritual priority, not that women ran everything, although they could have. It was equity, valued perhaps for different reasons, but equally valued. And she said that this was all over the Middle East and the European Neolithic period. So this was spurned in the time between the end of the 1890s through most of the 20th century, and even today in mainstream academics. And it did create the explosion of New Age ecofeminism in the 1990s, which got caught up with these earlier Victorian ideas, and they celebrated Gimbutas as their champion. So mainstream archaeology and mainstream history blamed her for muddying the waters, for cherry-picking things just to prove her point, that she had not been keeping up with advances. And they, it was hugely reverse sexism. They called her a reverse sexist, that she was creating myths. And this is what I find really reprehensible. She had escaped the Soviet incursion during World War II. She had escaped and ended up finally in the United States. They psychoanalyzed her and accused her of being traumatized by this Russian incursion, and that her theories, her professional theories, were a pathological response to her to the invasion of the Soviets in the end of World War II. So she died in 1994, and she didn't get to see the backlash to her theories, but she also wasn't around to respond to them. So there felt like there was probably an element of truth to what she had to say, but that happens to be a fact about most archaeological and historical theory from the Neolithic period, because they haven't done enough research. So when male scholars put forth these sorts of theories, they get prizes. They get hailed as genius thinkers, and aren't they creative and inventive? Women are psychoanalyzed to see what's pathological about them. She was seen as somebody who was meddling in an area that was best left for men. Honest to God, that's what they said. So she became an object of dismissive contempt. But, as I wrote, recent DNA studies support her theories. It really did happen. There really was an expansion of herding people from the Black Sea in around the 3rd millennium BC just like she posited, and there was a huge population replacement, and they spread the Indo-European language exactly as she had said. They replaced a matriarchal culture with a patriarchal, warlike one, just exactly like she said. So they can only assume that the other things that she proposed about ranking and having an aristocracy of war heroes, those sorts of things were probably true too. But the book here says, to be clear, that she never argued outright for Neolithic matriarchies. Matriarchy means that not how the term is used wrong. So let's just clear up the term. A matriarchy means that the mother is the model for the economic basis of female authority. And in all other aspects of life besides the home life, the women would hold the preponderance of power. And there have been matriarchies. The Wendots were matriarchal. Catalhoyuk, the guy that we've quoted so much, their longhouses were 5 to 6 families per longhouse, and each was run by a council of women. Men did not have a parallel council. There wasn't a real council of men, and then we'll let the women have their council. No, the women ran things. And the women's council controlled all the key stockpiles of food. They held veto power over all male decisions. Other groups did the same thing: the Hopi, the Zuni, the Pueblo nations. And in Sumatra, there's a Muslim culture called Minangkabau, I think is how it's said, organized exactly the same way. Now, this is different from gynarchy, the political rule of women. So just Margaret Thatcher was not in charge of a matriarchy. Queen Elizabeth, not in charge of a matriarchy. Even Queen Elizabeth I, not in charge of a matriarchy. The Dowager Emperor of China, not a matriarchy. They ruled, but they appointed men under them that had authority. And often men had authority at home. True matriarchy uses the mother-child relationship, the domestic power, and it branches out into the rest of the culture. So thank you to the viewer who recommended this woman to me, and I'll recommend her book. I'm going to try to find it and read it in my spare time. So back to Catalhoyuk. They found there many figurines, female forms of art, and they used to think that these little fat female naked figures were pregnant women of the goddess. And now they're beginning to think, wait a minute, maybe this is honoring matriarchy. Maybe these are female elders and not pregnant at all. So they don't find the equivalent male forms. They find one or two maybe phallic things that are mixed in the rubble, but the preponderance are these little female forms. And there's no indication that women lived better than men. There's no indication that women subjugated men. But there was a parity of diet and health. They can study the bones they find, and they can figure out what your diet was and what parts of the world you lived in, depending on the isotopes in your bones. It's very interesting. And they were also able to tell a parity of how bodies were treated after death, which is always, not always, but usually an indication of whether or not there was a hierarchy, and if there was a hierarchy, who was at the top. So there's one exception to these buildings at Catalhoyuk. They all have indoor wall paintings. And what are these wall paintings of? Men at the hunt. There's no sign of a central authority. Each household is a world unto its own. They had their own ritual area, their own food storage areas. It's like they were all little isolated kingdoms, each house all on its own. And it's unclear what they did to maintain household autonomy. How did the whole thing work? They seem to be, what went on in the community seemed to be learned within the household. That family routines were similar to Native American great houses with large family groups, and the cohesion of the larger community was learned through the interaction of the extended family in these groups. And there was a huge value put on routine. The importance of everything was done the same way. Houses, this is so interesting. Their houses were used for 50 to 100 years. Then they were intentionally pulled down and new ones were put in their place, but they used the exact same footprint. They just built a new foundation on top of the old foundation. They put the new walls exactly where the old walls had been. The floor plans were identical for millennia. I guess they can figure that out. I don't know how. They put the ovens, the hearths, storage bins, every place exactly the same, but there was no sign of a hierarchy or a rank. All the houses were rebuilt over time, and as they were rebuilt, as they were older sites, they accumulated prestige just because somebody's lived in this spot for 2,000 years. That became important. And they know this from the density of the trophies, the animal trophies, and obsidian that they found in any given area, and the platforms, the burial platforms. Don't forget there's dead bodies under there. This is consistent with the notion that elders, especially women, were influential. There's a degree of gender symmetry, complementarity. So like men were the big shot hunters, but women were the big shot decision makers, that kind of thing. The masculine, feminine domains were separate, even inside the houses. Men were in a different spot in the house. There was no reference to agriculture, only to hunting and foraging for thousands of years. So we have only excavated 5% of this area. And surveys that they've done with sonar or radar or whatever indicate that the rest of the layout is similar, but what are they going to find in there? That's like Herculaneum is underneath a modern town, Ercolano, and it's a fraction of what really exists underground. And every time somebody gets their toilet fixed, they discover more archaeology. It's just so bizarre. They can't keep up with it. They've got storehouses surrounded by chain link fences, open air storehouses of statues and bits of statuary and urns and pots and just. And we spoke with an archaeologist. She was cleaning the floors in a villa. They're all open air, they're falling apart, they're ancient. And it was these beautiful tiled floors. And she was getting a little bit irritated because no sooner would she brush off the tile than another tourist would come through. So when there was a lull, we asked her, what are you doing? Because, I'm nosy. And as best we could understand, what she said was that she was an archaeologist working for the Italian government. And she was making a book on the different kinds of flooring in ancient Rome because they're beautiful, unbelievable. And she said it had never been done because the government doesn't have the money. They have such an abundance of archaeological riches. They just can't even begin to address it. There aren't enough archaeologists. So if somebody in your family who's young wants to go into archaeology, there's something to think about there. Anyway, so they've only excavated 5% of this place, and they knew that they kept their floors well swept, speaking of floors, because they can't find a lot of microscopic evidence of past activity in the plaster, which I guess is something that they do. And they were so clean that that's even hard to find. But they did find traces of reed mats that had been used as flooring. So the floors were covered in mats. So this place is right next to the swamps, right next to wetlands, and these swamps flooded seasonally. And the winters were cold and damp, and the summers were hot and muggy. And from spring to autumn, they had animals that they herded to the higher grasslands. And they discovered that these people were farming on the flooded plains, that when the water receded and there was silt, the soil was replenished by the receding water, kind of like the Nile, they would take these little pockets of area and grow things like the gardens of Adonis. So this would all have required a periodic dispersal of the population, because they have to go with the herds and then come back after the floods and do a little planting. So we may be seeing a winter settlement that focused on hunting and the veneration of the dead, and then the rest of the year they were elsewhere. This is a different social reality than a time of 100% agriculture. The life of growing and herding are separate from the indoor life of the household and separate from each other. So the argument is, where or if they planted, their dry land was 8 miles away. So they didn't have oxen and they didn't have carts. So is it reasonable to assume that they would go plant way on the dry land? No. So they were using these receding areas on the floodplain seasonally. And we now know that the first cattle to be domesticated were domesticated in the Fertile Crescent 1,000 years ago. And I'm sorry, not 1,000 years ago, 1,000 years earlier than these people. Catalhoyuk refused to use domestic cattle and pigs. And so the question is, was this a cultural refusal? Did they refuse to do it because they didn't like the people around them that did do it? And there was a lot of prestige for men to lose if they domesticated cattle and pigs, because they got their prowess from hunting these wild boar and these vicious cattle things. And if they were domesticated, they became docile, and the men had nothing to be hunters about. So they may have rejected the notion of domesticating animals just for that reason, because they had an abundance available to them. The term Fertile Crescent was adopted in the 19th century. It's a term really had to do with European colonization of the Middle East, and it had more to do with modern empirical politics than anything else. Now, it's an archaeological term for the area where farming began, but really it's inaccurate. There were actually two crescents. There was the upland up to the Taurus Zagros Mountains between Syria and Turkey, and there were the lowlands that were woodlands and terrain around river systems. And they were very different from each other. Between 10,000 to 8,000 BC, forager societies transformed differently in these two areas. So you saw foragers become something in the uplands and something entirely different in the lowlands. And difficult to explain, difficult to describe, and as this book puts it, they were a complex mosaic. And that's where archaeology and history, modern theory, has it wrong. They weren't one thing, all of them, and then they became another. They were a mosaic, and some never became the other. In both areas, they had similar kinds of settlements, varieties, and similar varieties of activities, but they did show signs of schismogenesis. I'm not going to do it because those guys over there do it. And it was a cultural frontier. There was overlap, there was interaction, there was trade, there was cultural exchange, and there was cultural rejection. Sharp distinctions. The uplands had a hierarchy, and this would be Göbekli Tepe. The lowlands had no monument building, and the societies were completely different. The two groups were well acquainted with each other by trade. It's called the Levantine Corridor from the Euphrates in Syria into the Jordan River Valley. And in this lowland area, they had very different crafts associated with cult buildings, seasonal lodges. And the question that these guys are asking is, was this related to guilds, to medieval guilds? Because it was a distinctive association of people who all did the same craft. Trade wealth was high, and it supported a denser population and eventually turned into big cities like Jericho and Basta. It was a diverse area with differences in climates, microclimates, a little bit like California. The topography changed quite a bit quickly, and you had niche produce. You had one area that was good for one kind of plant and another area right next to it because of its elevation or its woods. It was an entirely different sort of area. And early crops developed in scattered pockets throughout the population. You just never knew what exactly you were going to get. And in the upland crescent, the earliest livestock management was done alongside hunting and foraging. And they often cultivated cereal, and they didn't use the cereal to eat. They used it for ceremonial purposes. The domesticated crops are crops that can no longer grow wild, and they went into this big botanical explanation of the whole thing, and I decided not to write it down. But essentially, it's got to do with if you try to seed plants by pulling the tops off the wheat and putting them in the ground elsewhere, they will change. They will mutate, and they'll no longer be able to do that for themselves. It's an interesting little fact. So you end up making them dependent on human intervention, or they won't grow. So domestic crops started in various different parts of the Fertile Crescent. People settled in these parts and used wheat stalks for other things long before they ever planted wheat for themselves. They used the straw. They gathered wild wheat straw for fuel, to add to mud, to build bricks. And they did a lot of really involved basket weaving and matting and thatching. By using the straw, by pulling it up and interfering with the life cycle, they caused the wheat to mutate, and it needed humans to seed it. So this can happen as quickly as within 20 years. It doesn't take thousands of years to happen. So the cultivation of wild cereal grasses began 3,000 years before they seriously started domesticating plants for food. So that the time period between those two things, from the time they started using wild grasses till the time they decided to actually become farmers, was a time period that's equal to the length of time between the Trojan War and our time today. It took a long time for them to get around to it. So why? Why did it take so long? So they've been able to show that the cultivation of what they call pre-domesticated cultivation happened so much sooner than the serious farming by using wild plants and giving them a nudge. So they would weed a little bit around. They wouldn't plant it, but they would go to where they knew it grew, and they would clear it out a little bit, or they would prune it if it was a tree, but they wouldn't intentionally plant it. And they did this for a long, long time, because really planting things is hard work. Farming it stinks, it's tilling and rock moving and weeding and harvesting, and they didn't want to be bothered with that. So they've been able to show that cultivating wild cereals in northern Syria was at least 10,000 BC, but domesticating it wasn't for eating it, didn't happen until 7,000 BC. So, thousands of years. And this is an important period of time where people cultivated the wild stuff by encouraging it, quit because it was too much work, tried to plant it, decided, there was a lot of back and forth and back and forth. So this back and forth actually has a term because it's so common. It's called flood retreat, and they do it in seasonal floods. They let nature replenish the soil, and then they'll go in and encourage whatever's growing there. They let nature determine where things grow, and they're more oriented towards collecting, but they're flexible to encourage as well. And these people did the minimum amount. See, our forefathers and mothers were very smart. They did the minimum amount of work for subsistence at the location that they occupied, that they were occupying for other reasons. So if they were there for hunting, or they were there for fishing or trading, they did the bare minimum that they could get away with and have enough to eat. Do just a little bit more because this is running long. Let's see here what I wanted to read to you. Rejecting the Garden of Eden type narrative for the origins of farming also means rejecting, or at least questioning, the gendered assumptions lurking behind the narrative. Apart from being a story about the loss of primordial innocence, the book of Genesis is also one of history's most enduring charters for the hatred of women, rivaled only in the Western tradition by the prejudices of Greek authors like Hesiod, or for that matter, Plato. It's Eve, after all, who proves too weak to resist the exhortations of the crafty serpent and is first to bite the forbidden fruit, because she's the one who desires knowledge and wisdom. Her punishment, and that of all women following her, is to bear children in severe pain and live under the rule of her husband, whose own destiny is to subsist by the sweat of his brow. Consciously or not, it's the contributions of women that get written out of these sorts of accounts of, how these Neolithic societies evolved. Harvesting wild plants and turning them into food, medicine, and complex structures like baskets or clothing is almost everywhere a female activity, and may be gendered female even when practiced by men. This is not quite an anthropological universal, but it's about as close to one as you're ever likely to get. So, women sew, unless it's high fashion that makes a lot of money, and then it's okay if you're a man. Strong associations, archaeological associations exist between women and plant-based knowledge. Women did the first gardens and grew herbs for medicine and pigment and crafts like baskets and stuff. And interesting, there's a lot of math and sacred geometry associated with these things, and women were the first ones to indulge in that. So agriculture is about consciously getting food, and it's just about planting for food. Domestication is about the control of the animals, and this is versus botany and gardening, which women did, where they created garden spots that favored the specific plants that they wanted. So they wouldn't grow a crop, they would have things that they wanted. This persisted, and it allowed nature to do the hard work for them. And the bending, the coaxing, the cajoling, and the nurturing of nature. Art indicates that there was a new awareness of women's status working with plants and nature. And women had an understanding that men often didn't have. A non-laboratory, directly in the field science of women. Women's work done leisurely included an understanding of plants, soils, clay, water, weather, geometry, and math, and the radical inequality that we might think would exist would not be a likely outcome in this sort of culture. People in the North were similar, except that this is in the Fertile Crescent in the north, but they built monoliths. Here we go again. And they lived in proximity to the people that were more matriarchal, but sharply different cultures. So I'm going to stop here. This is running late, and I'll be back with this at some point between now and the end of time. Not today. I'm going to stop for the day. Can't find my pen, of course. Anyway, this is the end of part 6, and we will start with part 7. I think that's right. Tomorrow. Is that right? Let me make sure. Don't want to mislead. Oh, no, this is the end of part 5. So we'll start with part 6. Probably not tomorrow. Sometime this week. So thank you for watching. I've gotten a lot of positive feedback. A lot of people are really interested in this. I'm thrilled. I'm so pleased. You have to know, I agonize about what book I'm going to do. And just because I like it doesn't necessarily mean anyone else in the whole entire world is going to like it. And I'm always afraid people are just going to have their eyes crossed and give up on this channel because these books are so weird. I know they jump around. There is a thread, though. If you look, you'll notice a thread between most of them. And I think I have a book for when this is done, and there's a very interesting thread there too. So thank you for watching. I really appreciate it. I hope you enjoy this, and I'll be back in the next day or two with more fun stuff about the crime syndicate going on in the Republican House of Representatives and Senate. And in the meantime, slán go fóill and slánsean.